A return to testing is finally in sight this week in Starbase. Starship 37 is being prepared for its static fire right now, and is receiving its last components ahead of this crucial final pre-flight test campaign. But will we see fire this week? Meanwhile, Ship 38 is gearing up for cryogenic proof testing as part of its own pre-launch preparations. And an old friend, Booster 13, made a return to the spotlight. Howdy Star Partners, I'm Beyer for NSF, and this is your Starbase Update. Before we dive into the major topics of the week, let's first take a moment to check out some of the latest infrastructure developments happening around Starbase. On Monday, we saw yet another move of a single ring from the Star Factory over to the Sanchez lot. This most likely related to the ongoing outfitting and testing of new Block 3 tooling and hardware being developed inside the Star Factory. Let me explain. The tooling, work stands, automatic welding robots, and all of the other supporting infrastructure inside the factory need to be reconfigured to match the changes SpaceX has introduced with Starship Block 3. The stream of single rings we've been seeing moved out from time to time are most likely the result of testing and calibrating either new capacity in the Star Factory as it's built out, or changes related to Block 3 upgrades, along with, of course, failed rings either from configuration issues or otherwise. And I say failed here with a big asterisk, because that's probably their intended purpose, to help dial in the machines and fine-tune the assembly lines for Block 3 and future iterations, well before full-scale production ramps up. With Booster 18 and Ship 39 being the first actual units from the Block 3 line, it's safe to assume that SpaceX gathered a lot of valuable insights during their production process, and they're now applying those lessons across the board. But wait, there's more! The parade of rings didn't stop there this week. On Tuesday, another one of these single rings was moved out of the Star Factory building and transported over to the Sanchez lot. What's always interesting to observe during these moves is just how flimsy and flexible the rings look when they're on their own. You really get a sense of how thin the steel is. They only really start to gain structural strength once multiple sections are stacked together. As the crane lifts and moves them, you can actually see how wobbly the individual rings are, highlighting just how lightweight and delicate they are in isolation. That said, it's all relative. A chunk of stainless steel held in your hand is a hefty and sturdy thing, and really helps to underscore how powerful Raptor is and how wild it is that these things can fly into space, usually. We'll dive into the Starship of the show, Ship 37, in just a moment, but for now, let's shift our attention to Ship 38, which, just like Ship 37, is located inside Mega Bay 2. On Tuesday, we observed that SpaceX had begun the process of removing scaffolding from around the ship. This step is typically one of the last things they do before transporting a vehicle to the Massey outpost for cryogenic proof testing. But you may be asking, I thought Massey's was out of commission. Well, as we said in previous Starbase updates, the damage seemed limited to the static fire stand and related infrastructure. After a little bit of cleanup, the cryo testing station at Massey's now appears fully operational and ready for use. And it seems like the timing is lining up perfectly here. As the week went on, it really looked like Ship 38 was getting prepped and ready to make the move, with all signs pointing toward a rollout soon. And thanks to the new City of Starbase website, we got solid confirmation of that plan. A road closure was scheduled for July 26th, starting at 11:59 p.m. and running through to 4 a.m. on July 27th. So, in classic Starbase fashion, we're looking at a standard overnight transport window of about 4 hours to get the ship over to the Massey outpost. I'm recording this video on Saturday, so Ship 38's roll is still in the future. It's a couple hours from now. Depending on how things played out, Ryan, our editor for this video, is now showing you either some beautiful footage of Ship 38 rolling out to Massey's, or you're seeing my sad face because nothing else ended up happening. I suspect it'll be the former, though. Looking ahead, a likely timeline for 38 would involve a cryo-proof test on Monday or Tuesday, followed by additional testing throughout the week, and a potential rollback closer to the end of the week. If Ship 38 successfully passes this test campaign, the next step for it will be engine installation, and that'll be something that'll become much more important a little bit later in the video. One thing we can say with confidence is that even after the cryo-proof testing is completed, Ship 38 will still need a significant amount of work on its thermal protection system. I mean, just look at it. The bottom segment has barely been started, and there's a large section in the middle covering about 3 full rings that hasn't had a single tile attached yet. So, getting all of this detailed work done, and honestly, we're not just talking about the fine details here, but also some major unfinished areas, is going to take time. Realistically, we're looking at several weeks of effort ahead, so you can definitely expect Ship 38 to have another extended stay inside Megabay 2 following its cryo campaign, while all of its tiles get properly installed and thoroughly checked. It's time for our McGregor Minute. Let's take a closer look at all of the engine tests SpaceX carried out this week at their engine test facility in McGregor, Texas. At the Raptor South stand this week, we saw a total of 11 tests, with a combined firing time of roughly 400 seconds. One particularly notable test sequence happened on the 22nd. It's something we've seen several times before, but it never gets old to watch. SpaceX performed multiple relights of a Raptor engine during that session, firing it initially for 20 seconds, then shutting it down and relighting it 3 more times. Each of these relights lasted about 20 seconds, adding up to a total of around 80 seconds of testing across 4 separate ignitions. Overall, the 20-second test pattern was very prominent throughout the week at McGregor. This likely indicates a focus on testing ignition sequences and startup of the Raptor rather than running long-duration burns, which are a different type of test altogether. As we speculated last week, perhaps this is Raptor 3 related. Over on the Falcon side of things, SpaceX tested 4 Merlin vacuum engines, an important part of maintaining the high launch cadence that they'll need if they want to hit their ambitious goal of over 170 launches in a single year. And that wraps up this week's McGregor overview. Be sure to check out our 24/7 McGregor Live test stream so you never miss a single engine test. Now, let's head back to Starbase. On Tuesday, something happened that we've been tracking for quite a while now, and that was the return of lift boat Jill, the ship used to recover booster hardware from the ocean floor. Sure enough, it came back with an old friend of ours on the deck, or at least part of it, the aft section of Booster 13. Quick reminder, Booster 13 was flown on Starship Flight 6, the mission where SpaceX initially aimed for the second ever catch of a Super Heavy booster, but had to abort that attempt due to issues with the tower. It took some time, but now the booster has finally made its return. The aft end of the booster was partly covered by a tarp, but it was clear that SpaceX successfully covered the vast majority of it. The big question is, why exactly did they recover this section now? There are probably 2 main reasons. First, SpaceX doesn't want others getting a close look at it. By pulling it out of the ocean, they prevent divers or competitors from exploring and learning more about the booster's design. Second, they want to learn from it for themselves. Every piece of hardware they can recover gives them valuable insight that they can use to improve future flights. Though I remain doubtful at what could be learned from it after so long underwater, the aft section is especially important because it houses some of the booster's most critical systems, including Raptor engines, the transfer tube's end, the header tank, and the engine manifold. So recovering this part probably offers the highest value to SpaceX in terms of data and development help. And third, it's just good to remove your trash from the ocean. I mean, seems like good stewardship of the environment, you know? On Thursday, SpaceX transported the remains of Booster 13 back to Starbase. More specifically, they chose the Massey outpost as the resting spot for this relic, likely to inspect it thoroughly before eventually scrapping what's left. It's kind of fascinating that even under the tarp, you can still clearly see the engines, despite the fact that they hit and then spent time submerged in the ocean. Of course, the booster performed a soft water splashdown, which probably helped the engine section remain mostly intact, preserving a surprising amount of detail despite the rough conditions. Alright, it's time for some pictures. Here's a look at the engine section with the tarp slightly removed, and you can still see most of the details incredibly clearly. Of course, you can spot the connection point where the header tank was originally installed. It looks like that part was lost at some point and is no longer attached. But the connection to the transfer tube remains clearly visible. What's really striking is that the entire manifold for all 33 Raptor engines is still in place. It's a fascinating mix of what looks like chaotic tubing and a perfectly orchestrated dance of pipes all working together. The bottom of a couple of the chines are still attached too, and if you look inside you can spot some hardware. However, the COPVs and CO2 tanks that normally sit inside the chines appear to be missing. It also looks like most of the Raptor engines are still attached. You can clearly see some exposed power heads on a few of the Raptor engines. Either their covers were lost over time, or maybe they were even intentionally removed. But these are definitely Raptor engines still connected to Booster 13, if you couldn't tell. Of course, these engines are no longer usable, having been exposed to salt water for an extended period. But still, by recovering all this hardware, SpaceX might gain valuable insights that could help improve future designs. Also, we can now daydream about them taking one of these recovered Raptor engines, somehow refurbishing it, and firing it at McGregor. I mean, that'd be a really fun McGregor Minute, right? It's definitely the week of old booster interest in SpaceX, as SpaceX also turned its attention to Booster 12 this week. Yes, the very same Booster 12 that made history as the first booster to successfully land inside the Chopsticks catch arms. This isn't the first time we've seen activity around this booster, but it always raises a few questions. Why is SpaceX giving so much attention to an older prototype? Our hope, of course, is that this is part of a plan to put Booster 12 on a permanent display stand of some kind, preserving it as a piece of history for generations to come. But it could also be something simpler. Maybe they just want to take a closer look at how a particular component or components are aging. Or perhaps they're using it as a teaching aid for new employees. Or it could be preparations for scrapping, but even SpaceX wouldn't dare do that with the very first caught booster, right? Right? SpaceX is continuing to work full steam ahead on Pad 2, which of course is required to bring the highly anticipated Block 3 Starship upgrades online. Because of the massive modifications to both the booster and the ship, all the old connection hardware on Pad 1 is no longer compatible, meaning the rocket requires a new pad and completely new infrastructure. One of the key components that changed is the QD, or Quick Disconnect. For Block 3, the booster design is switching from a single QD to 2 QDs, allowing for much faster refueling turnaround times. This first carriage arm for this new system had already been installed on Pad 2 last week. Then, during the night on Monday, we saw the second carriage roll out, and SpaceX wasted no time at all lifting and installing it at the launch site just hours later. Of course, this isn't a fully finished Quick Disconnect yet. These are just the moving bits that hold the QD plates, plumbing, and everything else. The majority of the internal piping inside the housing still needs to be installed, which will likely happen over the coming weeks. And once everything is in place, a QD plate will be installed at the front. This plate is something we've seen on every piece of hardware that needs to connect to either a ship or a booster so far. It's sort of like the spine of the rocket's central nervous system, managing and connecting not only the main fuel lines, but also secondary data and power cables that run through the QD to the booster. Side note, while we were in our writer's room, I was trying to come up with a good analogy. Adrian said it was like the heart, I said it was like the spine, other people said it was like a USB thumb drive? I don't know. What do you think is the best analogy for a QD plate? Put it in the comments. Looking at this photo here, we can clearly see the difference in progress between the two quick disconnects. The newly installed one on the left is of course still very bare bones and missing many features. Meanwhile, the one on the right is much further along, already sporting its protective hood and some of its piping installed. You can also spot one of the massive pipes that will supply one of the main propellants. In this case, the hooded cover on the right carriage is for the methane quick disconnect. You can imagine that big pipe is designed for methane flow, while the smaller secondary lines handle things like methane return, CO2, or helium loading, nitrogen loading, all that sort of stuff. The unhooded cover on the left, the one that was just installed, is the carriage for the liquid oxygen QD. Looking at Pad 2's overall readiness, we can see that the chopsticks are still surrounded by scaffolding and actively being worked on. On the mount itself, SpaceX appears to be in that critical phase where all the pipes, lines, and wiring from the support structures are being installed directly onto the pad. This stage makes big, obvious progress a little bit harder to track visually. But, as always with projects this massive, the devil is in the details, and those details are crucial for a new launch pad and a new rocket to work successfully. But when we say the devil is in the details, it doesn't mean that all the big hardware components have already been installed onto the supporting structure. On Tuesday, the crane at the site was once again in action, lifting and installing larger components onto the gantry. It will also be interesting to see if SpaceX eventually adds extra shielding to the support structure, given that a giant super heavy booster will be launching right next to it. The most likely answer? Probably a definite yes. In fact, it looks like they're starting to assemble some of that cladding on site next to the mount. On Monday, the chopsticks on Tower 1 moved down after spending an extended period in the raised position. While testing could always be a possible reason for them to be up in the air, the most likely explanation is something we've seen before at Starbase's other tower, Tower 2. And that is that SpaceX wants to make sure the chopsticks aren't in the way during construction work at the base of the pad. With the static fire adapter lift and the ongoing work on the ship's makeshift quick disconnect, this area sees a lot of crane traffic. So keeping the space clear of two giant chopsticks dangling overhead, which could pose a safety risk during lifts, definitely seems like the smarter move, and that's probably the explanation here. With the lift now complete and the crane gone, the sticks could lower. Speaking of static firing a ship on Pad 1's mount, here it is. The structure being on top of the booster QD that will allow the ship to be securely hooked up to propellant lines. Naturally, it needs to sit higher since the ship will rest on the adapter, meaning it will be slightly elevated compared to how a booster sits on the orbital launch mount. This construction appears to be nearing completion, and one of the next major steps will be installing the quick disconnect plate we talked about earlier in the video. Once that's in place, we could be surprisingly close to seeing Ship 37 installed atop the orbital launch mount. So with this, we're getting closer to a very interesting decision point that SpaceX will likely have to face. In what order will they conduct testing on the orbital launch mount? Option A is pretty similar to what we're seeing now. They would install Ship 37, perform its static fire test, then remove it from the pad, take off the adapter, reconfigure the pad back to its normal setup, and finally place the full stack on it for launch. This approach probably gets them quicker short-term results, but it comes with the drawback of needing to reinstall the adapter again ahead of Ship 38's static fire testing. You may remember us going through this possibility on a previous Starbase update, but things have changed. Now, with Ship 38 heading for proof testing, another option is gaining traction, one that would likely delay Flight 10 by a few weeks, but could speed up Flights 10 and 11 overall in the long run. In this alternative, SpaceX would test 37 first, then wait for Ship 38 to be ready for static fire and test it on the orbital launch mount as well. This approach would eliminate the need to remove and reinstall the adapter between tests, and frankly, makes a lot of sense to me. The catch is that Ship 38 isn't anywhere near static fire readiness just yet. Typically, it takes about a month between completing cryo testing and being ready for a static fire, which means we're probably looking at mid-August at the earliest for that test, even if they accelerate the process. This also means that a launch before September for Flight 11 would no longer be possible. It's got to be a tough decision for SpaceX to make, and right now it's hard to predict which path they'll choose. I'm going to hold firm with my comments from the previous video and say they likely won't delay Flight 10 to get 38 static fired, but hey, I could be wrong. On Wednesday, another clear sign that Ship 37's static fire is imminent came into view. Inside Mega Bay 2, we could see that the ship was receiving its aft flaps. This step is usually one of the final ones before a ship's static fire campaign, since they often run flap movement and electrical system tests as part of that process. Of course, this campaign is different from all previous ones, but historically, installing the aft flaps has been a strong indicator that a static fire is right around the corner. Now, all that's left is to wait for a transport road closure to be scheduled, and then the excitement will really start to build. And speaking of that very thing, a road closure for transport of Ship 37 was scheduled for Sunday night, Monday morning, so there you have it. We should be in for a lift of Ship 37 onto the mount on Monday, followed by testing of some kind, hopefully to include one or more static fires, this week. Hooray! Clearly trying to hit that schedule, on Thursday, SpaceX lifted another piece onto the ship adapter on Pad 1's mount, a part that looked almost like some sort of clamp. It's not entirely clear what this component was used for, but it's most likely related to the installation and securing of the static fire adapter for the ships. Perhaps it's part of some modifications that will help with the initial installation process. Want more signs of progress? We've got them for you. Shortly after installing that clamp-like piece, SpaceX performed a Purge Vent on the newly installed ship propellant lines. This process is done to clear out all the FOD, foreign object debris, things like sand and other stuff from inside the lines. This purge is most likely one of the final steps before SpaceX can install the quick disconnect plate we mentioned a few times earlier, which will then sort of seal the majority of the system. Doing a thorough purge beforehand makes perfect sense if you want to avoid sand or other contaminants from streaming through your hardware, including the ship itself, down the line. I mean, in the future, but also down the propellant lines, because there was another item of note over the course of the week though, and that was that SpaceX updated its website with some pretty neat new features. One highlight is the new departure board, which gives a clearer picture of upcoming SpaceX flights. It's not quite as detailed as next spaceflight, but it's probably the next best thing. They also added a dedicated section for every current and planned SpaceX launch pad, except for Slick 6. For some reason. Why? They're building a pad there. It's an awesome launch site. Why would they? Every pad, but Slick 6, why? The update even includes a section for the newly planned Launch Complex 37 at Cape Canaveral, complete with some super cool renders. Even though Slick 6 is way more real and complete, but whatever, I'll shut up about it. Now, some of you might be thinking, wow, what a clean looking launch pad. And yeah, it would be clean if it actually looked like that. But in reality, this render is more of an artistic interpretation rather than a true-to-life depiction of the complex. Sure, the towers and deluge tank farms are there, but the giant tank farm you'd expect to see in the top left corner is completely missing. Instead, there's a retention pond, and overall, a lot of the planned infrastructure is either missing or just isn't shown based on the FAA's site plans. So while the render looks cool, the actual launch complex will probably look quite a bit different. Hopefully, I'm sure it will, still be just as impressive. The best thing about this might not actually be the render itself though, but rather the reaction it sparked when friend of the channel, John Krause, posted it on X. Elon Musk responded with, quote, "Shortly before the next flight, I will do a live technical update on Starship, going over progress to date and engineering/production/launch plans for the future," end quote. So hey, we might just get an Elon presentation before Flight 10. That would be great news for all of us, especially from the way that he phrased it. This sounds like it could be a very technical presentation, exactly the kind of deep dive we felt was missing from the last update, which was more visionary than technical. At this point, we've all heard the song and dance about making life multiplanetary that's meant for the general public. We want to hear about HLS progress, ship-to-ship refilling work, ECLS, that's environmental control and life support systems, in situ resource utilization and/or Martian propellant plants. You know, the good stuff. Fingers crossed that that is what we get. What a week of progress on all fronts. Now, we have to wait and see if Ship 37 indeed static fires this week, and what Ship 38 will do after its cryo test campaign. Let us know in the comments below what you think. When do you expect each of these tests to happen? Do you believe Flight 10 will still take place in August, or has it slipped into September at this point? Thanks for watching, and as always, be excellent to each other.
And an old friend, Booster 13, made a return to the spotlight.
Dan, what did we say about you doing? No,
I know, I just move around.
Get out of here, go, get out, you.